Remember Professor Mark Bray? He's a Dartmouth lecturer, a self-described historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism, as well as the author of the newly released Anti-Fascist Handbook. But he has a soft spot in my heart because he holds the distinct honor of making the Southern Poverty Law Center look sane and reasonable by comparison. Back in August, after the Charlottesville incident, Bray appeared on Meet the Press explaining why he believes violence is a legitimate response to ideas.
If you get fascists to be powerful enough in government, they're simply not going to listen to the kind of public opinion that nonviolence can generate. That's the argument for resistance to Nazis.
And even the SPLC president said, whoa, dude, too far.
I think it's a spectacularly bad idea to give one group of people the right to silence another group of people.
Well, since that segment, Bray has published his book and traveled on a several months-long speaking tour in support of it, a tour which brought him to the University of California, Berkeley, a few weeks ago. There's a recording available, and I like to listen to this type of lecture from a person with whom I have profound disagreement, because it's in the long form you can get his thoughts in depth, not just brief quotes or sound bites. Most often I still don't agree, but understanding opposition really helps strengthen my own position. Or at least that's what I hope for, often naively, but what I end up with is just an hour lost to inconsistency and incoherence, which I think is actually the case in this instance, but I watched it, so damn it, you're getting a video about it. It's hard to interpret this professor. At times he describes himself as just an observer of Antifa, describing their motivations and perspectives without actually endorsing them. But at other times, he does endorse them. Explicitly. And he said elsewhere that he's donating half the proceeds from his book to cover the legal, medical, and personal expenses of Antifa activists. That's enough for me to consider this guy an activist rather than just a simple academic observer or messenger. But I'll leave it to you to decide if you think he's describing his own views or just the views of people he studies. But no matter the source of the reasoning, it has several areas of inconsistency that need to be highlighted. The first of which is that this lecture even took place at all. Much of this lecture is devoted to debating when it's appropriate to oppose fascism by force, but it should be noted, not a single fascist attempted to stop him from speaking, not just at this Berkeley stop, but as far as I can tell, anywhere else on the months-long tour.
I've been to Reno, Chicago, Fargo, Minnesota, Buffalo, Toronto, Winslow, Sarasota, Wichita, Tulsa, Ottawa, Oklahoma, Tampa, Panama, Mattawa, La Paloma.
All those stops, and not a single fascist tried to stop him fascistically. All those fascists are a major problem. Yet they allow him to tour the country criticizing them unopposed. At the heart of Professor Bray's reasoning is the idea that you can't let these apparently invisible and incompetent fascists speak and organize because it will inevitably lead to violence and destruction.
It's not always so clear when things have gotten bad enough to defend ourselves. Therefore, anti-fascists argue that you don't let fascist or white supremacist organizing take even the first step. So post-war anti-fascists have argued that you should treat every small white supremacist and fascist group as if they could be Hitler's 54 or Mussolini's 100, recognizing that of course most of them won't be, possibly none of them would be, but if even only one of them is, then it's worth shutting it down. You fight them by writing letters and making phone calls, so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists so you don't have to fight them with knives. You fight them with knives so you don't have to fight them with guns. You fight them with guns so you don't have to fight them with tanks.
But that reasoning is entirely self-defeating. What happens if we let Antifa speak and organize? What if it leads to bike lock assaults? What if it leads to hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage? What if it leads to violence against women? Under Bray's reasoning, it would be fully justifiable to shut down this very lecture by force. But nobody does because everyone else understands that words and violence are different things, and that violent self-defense from ideas is a nonsensical concept. But it's okay because he doesn't think of self-defense from a common sense perspective.
So in my perspective, I think that self-defense against these groups is legitimate, and it's also worth to point out that anti-fascists understand self-defense a little different from how the common sense perspective is.
I think he means they don't think of self-defense in a conventional sense or under a traditional definition, but the way he describes his concept of self-defense does indeed violate common sense. On the issue of self-defense, most people would say something like, when violence is committed in aggression against you, violence in response is a justifiable action. So the question of when self-defense is justified hinges on what you consider to be violence. And Bray offers some unusual thoughts. Questioned on whether Antifa property destruction in Berkeley was tactically effective, Bray isn't even willing to concede that property destruction is violence.
So you talk about direct action politics, but what happened in Berkeley on February 1st was there was a distinction between protesting and, of course, taking violent action. And that's what the media is focused on, and that's sort of earned Antifa a bad rap. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about the use of violence and how it plays out, both positive. What's the positive and what's the negative?
Sure. Well, I mean, first, I think it's not always self-evident what is and is not violence. I think that violence is whatever people think it is, so I go with a sort of like historically, socially contextual interpretation. Some people argue property destruction isn't violent. Most people think it is, and I think that that's an important thing to take into account. And if people want to engage in property destruction, they should be ready for that critique.
It baffles me that he thinks violence is some nebulous concept. Violence is the use of physical force. It's a clearly definable idea. But that's fine. I don't care if he wants to entertain the idea that only physical force against the person should qualify as violence. It's not that alone that bothers me. What bothers me is he's using an unusually strict definition of violence to shield Antifa from criticism. But when it comes to criticizing alleged fascists, suddenly the lines around violence get really blurry.
Does white power or fascist organizing in and of itself necessarily pose a threat? If you think that it does not necessarily pose a threat, and you're willing to give these kinds of people the benefit of the doubt that their organizing will not result in attacks on immigrants, attacks on LGBTQ people, attacks on Muslims or Jews, then militant confrontation may not be merited. If you do not give them the benefit of the doubt, if you assume that there's only a matter of time before someone gets shot, someone gets stabbed, someone gets beaten up, then you will do whatever it takes to shut them down. And in that sense, the by any means necessary line does apply to anti-fascism.
I can entertain non-traditional definitions of terms as long as those definitions remain consistent across the reasoning. It strikes me as wildly inconsistent to question whether property destruction counts as violence, but believe that certain ideas effectively qualify as violence in and of themselves. Either you have a strict definition of violence or a loose one, but not both applied arbitrarily to suit your argument's needs. And the inconsistencies get worse from there. At one point, an audience member asks about everyday people with non-controversial opinions being routinely attacked just for attending the wrong speaking event, or wearing the wrong hat, or voting the wrong way, or whatever else.
My question about that is that there's often a slogan within the anti-fascist movement, punch a Nazi. However, with what we've seen in Berkeley is a lot of people being attacked who aren't necessarily white supremacists or white nationalists, but just everyday people. So how would you condone the violence that has been acted on by groups like Antifa towards everyday people in the name of, fascism?
And Bray's answer is not that violence against them is unjustified, but that they should do a better job of aligning themselves with the correct opinions and distancing themselves from the incorrect ones.
I know that there is definitely a very concerning tendency that has existed throughout all of this history for fascists and white supremacists to infiltrate normal conservative spaces, demonstrations, parties, and so forth. So a lot of the kind of allegedly free speech demonstrations, allegedly Trump supporter demonstrations have been populated with known white supremacists and fascists. And so I think it's incumbent upon the center-right to distance itself from these kinds of groups and movements if they don't want to be lumped in together, because as it stands, the track record of college Republican groups and others inviting known white supremacists and fascists to participate in their events blurs and muddies the waters in a way that is reminiscent of the kind of growth of historical fascism and Nazism.
I don't think it's unreasonable to apply the term terrorism in this case. He is saying adopt certain political viewpoints or face violent consequences. And that standard is bad enough, but if you're giving out terroristic demands, at least give us the courtesy of being clear with them. In order to avoid violence, in order to get in line and avoid what you consider to be a justified punch to my face, what must I do? How do I avoid being a fascist in your perspective? He can't even tell us.
How is the definition of who counts as a fascist and not changed? What's the fringe of that? Who gets included? Who gets left out?
One is it's really hard to define what fascist is, and that's been true since the beginning, in part because fascists have historically adopted and discarded ideas more readily than anyone else. It's even more complicated in the post-war period when, in a lot of countries, it's undesired political baggage to label yourself a fascist or Nazi. If we view it not necessarily as one specific trans-historical ideology, but as sort of an overlapping map of tendencies and perspectives that revolve around certain core themes such as patriarchy, white supremacy, authoritarianism, and so forth, then you can kind of trace the ways that it can go.
So what we're left with is this bizarre situation with a thug threatening you, but trying to be academic and nuanced about it. Do what I say or you're getting the fist. Whoa, geez. Okay, what do you want me to do? Well, it's difficult to say. First, we have to consider how my demands ought to be interpreted in the post-war context, as well as the interaction of the social power dynamics between our intersectional identities. Actually, on second thought, could I just get the punch? It's way more bearable than this sanctimonious lecture. And if it's not irritating enough to listen to a quasi-terrorist who's not courteous enough to deliver his demands clearly, at one point he tells a minority student to do a better job of disavowing the alt-right.
I'm a conservative student, I'm a person of color, and I've been routinely harassed. I'm just wondering, do you think it's appropriate for them to just attack anyone they perceive as being a Nazi or perceive as being a white supremacist?
Well, clearly the point of contestation is whether that's what they're doing. I think certainly, have you repudiated alt-right individuals and groups? I don't know if you ever have, but you should. You really should.
But despite all of that nonsense, the part that actually bothers me the most is his philosophical view on free speech. He presents the argument that not only is Antifa not necessarily against free speech, but that they actually enhance it by making it more fair.
A lot of the debate here gets wrapped up in this idea of free speech. Sure. The response to hate speech is more speech.
I think a helpful way to think about the question, though, and sort of getting into sort of how I think about it, if you take a neutral absolutist perspective, then every individual and group just says whatever they want, and the outcomes of it are sort of irrelevant. And if you take what I would describe as a kind of anti-racist interpretation of free speech and say, okay, what are the practical effects of having white supremacists or fascist groups organizing in a community? Does that foster a situation where all individuals, regardless of race, religion, national identity, and so forth, feel comfortable participating equally in the public discourse? Then I think if you imagine it through that actually contextualized sense, then in terms of the promotion of actually lived, diverse understandings of free speech, it would be counterproductive to allow these kinds of groups to organize.
Aside from the fact that he previously told a minority student what to think and say in order to avoid violence, and now he's telling us how to help minorities feel safe to speak, I actually don't think he's entirely inconsistent on this point, just flat out wrong, which is a nice improvement. But I want to be clear about what he's describing, which is not free speech. I think the appropriate term would be fair speech, because what's free and what's fair are two different things, though they can overlap. Freedom means the absence of regulation, the absence of intervention, the absence of interference. Fairness is a subjective judgment about what ought to be, rather than what is, and thus requires regulation, requires intervention, requires interference. That's not to say what's free is always right and what's fair is always wrong, but freedom doesn't necessarily enhance fairness, and fairness doesn't necessarily enhance freedom. But we must acknowledge that what's deemed fair requires engineering, and what requires engineering requires the exercise of authority, and the exercise of authority always ought to be considered carefully. But suddenly I'm the one warning about slippery slopes to fascism. But the difference is I won't interfere with Professor Bray until he is actually harming people. Right now, he's touring the country, espousing views I find to be intellectually bankrupt. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say that he advocates unjustified violent aggression. But it's precisely because I think his ideas are bad that I want him to keep talking. I want him to keep losing the argument. And he is, and it's happening specifically because we do not live in a fascist society. Real fascists don't let you tour the country losing the argument, Professor Bray. They win the argument by force. And if they existed in any meaningful sense, they would have stopped your tour bus a long time ago. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it.